Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News Extra, broadcasting live from the Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Syria's President Ahmed Al-Sharaa meets US President Donald Trump at the White House for unprecedented talks. President Trump threatens to sue the BBC for $1 billion after its chair apologized for how the corporation edited a speech he made. And an end in sight for the record-breaking US shutdown as both sides of the Senate vote in favor of a deal. Now, Syria's President Ahmed Al-Sharaa has met with US President Donald Trump at the White House for unprecedented talks just days after Washington removed him from the sanctions list. Sharaa, whose opposition forces ousted longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad last year, is the first Syrian leader to visit the White House since the country's independence in 1946. To discuss this and all of today's stories, I'm joined by Dubai 92 presenter Jono, who's with me here in the studio, and correspondent Sara Firth, who joins me all the way from Washington. Sara, let's talk to you first. This is really a historic moment today, isn't it? Can you remind us of the background between Al-Sharaa and the US?
Yes, absolutely. It is a huge moment, and we've actually seen crowds outside the White House cheering for the Syrian president, Al-Sharaa. It wasn't that long ago that the State Department lifted his name off the global terror watch list. And we've seen this remarkable transformation in the relationship between the United States administration and Al-Sharaa. Over the weekend, he was seen playing basketball with the head of CENTCOM at Central Command here in the United States. I mean, these were people who were on opposite sides of the fight, if you like, until fairly recently. Now, he is the man who the US is pinning their hopes on for rebuilding, rehabilitating Syria. This is the first visit from a Syrian president since 1946. It is a major moment, but guys, it was a little bit more of a subdued arrival than we were perhaps expecting here in Washington. You know, usually you have the full 9 yards with President Trump coming out to meet them at the West Wing, and the flags and the whole sort of pomp and ceremony of it. This time it was much more under the radar. You had Al-Sharaa coming in through a side door. The meeting itself has been closed press, but I do want to tell you there has been some breaking news just in the past 10 minutes or so. We know that the US has said it is now, after that meeting between Al-Sharaa and President Trump, halting all of the Caesar Act sanctions on Syria, with the exception of some of the transactions between Russia and Iran. And I just want to read you actually what the State Department has said here, because it's really important. So this is the decision. Means that the Caesar Act sanctions have been lifted, according to the Department of Treasury, and it's added, the suspension halts the imposition of sanctions of the Caesar Act except for certain transactions, and this will include technology, software, funds, financing, or services. Now, this is so important because we've already seen President Trump, prior to this meeting, lifting some of those sanctions on Syria that were very restrictive when Syria was ruled by the Assad regime. Now you've had even more sanctions lifted, and that Caesar Act sanctions, you know, they were put in place when Bashar al-Assad was in power because of some of the atrocities his regime was committing. What it meant was that money was not moving into the country. And so this meeting and the announcement of these sanctions being lifted, hugely critical. The World Bank has estimated that it's going to cost something upwards of 200 million to start the rebuild of Syria. So the country desperately needs that investment coming in. This is going to be a sign to foreign investors. The US is behind the new Syrian president. They're supporting him, and potentially the money can now start moving. So it's a major moment, a very big achievement for the Syrian president who's meeting President Trump. So it's not the first time they've met, of course, but it is the first time in the White House for a Syrian president since 1946. So definitely a historic moment.
And you know what, Jono? A lot of what was trailed in this meeting coming up today was that Al-Sharaa was going to use this visit to push for a full repeal of the Caesars Act. And as Sara said to us, that has now happened. And those were those crushing sanctions that were put on Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. So like Sara says, momentous moment right now, because we're now seeing those sanctions be lifted to give Syria a chance to rebuild. But I want to talk a little bit more about this. Yes, it's a momentous moment, and the world is watching this. And last year, Al-Sharaa was in a very different position to what he is right now as he enters the White House. But it's coming at the same time where we are seeing minorities targeted in Syria. We are still seeing a fractious country in many respects after 13 years of civil war. You know, the Alawites are being targeted, the Druze are being targeted. There's a lot happening in Syria at the moment. And is there something which you think will possibly come up in discussion? Or will this be left out of conversations? Because you know how difficult it is to rebuild a country after such destruction.
I think the conversations that we're hearing about now and the sanctions being lifted is going to be the win, and that's going to be the focus for this as well. Giving airtime and giving exposure to the Alawites, who are traditionally linked to the Assad regime, is probably a foul move at this stage. Likewise, when you look at the Druze factions, which are, as you said, and Christians who are facing persecution currently in the country, giving airtime to any of that will take away from this new Syria narrative, which is what Washington wants to portray. In fact, both sides, both Syria and Washington, want to portray this new Syria. You don't want to open sectarian wounds if that's something that you're trying to do right now. What you've been looking back at is a 13-year war that's left 500,000 people dead, 13 million people have been displaced. The address that was made from May the 13th in this year, when Trump first off met in Saudi Arabia, was that this would be a new Syria, that we would be building something together. And you think, well, what's the attraction? Why are the US thinking that this is so important? Why is Syria so pivotal? And there's a few. There's the geopolitical location of Syria at the foot of Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel. They all sit in the heart of the Middle East. Syria plays a powerful place, dynamically speaking, and peace in Syria will be a huge deal for the US to be involved over that. Regional influence, whoever has leverage in Syria, will effectively affect Iran's reach. There's been a historical connection between Damascus, Moscow and Tehran. If you move in as the US and show the level of support that the Trump administration is doing, you're kind of moving away Damascus from both of those two factions, which is exactly what this administration wants to do. So I think, no, the focus will be on the big wins from this conversation, which will be lifting the sanctions. And that's exactly the portrayal that the White House will have as a result of this. And I think rightly so, that's what it needs to happen here. You don't want to go in there to say, listen, we're trying to solve issues on the ground. I think that will be his own doing. I think that will be necessary for him to go along himself and say, listen, right, I'm going to try and figure that out on home turf. But that's not what this conversation is about. That's not what he needs the US for right now.
And it's really interesting because I did speak to a US former diplomat in Syria in the first show, and he said the same thing to me. This is crucial for security reasons in the Middle East. The US can have an influence in Syria. We are having reports that the US would like to have an air base near Damascus to grow their influence in the region, which will make it stable overall. And that's what Donald Trump is aiming to do. But like you did say, Syria still has a dire humanitarian situation.
Absolutely.
And you know, now that Sara reminded us that the Caesar Act sanctions will be lifted, the country can get money into it, food can go to those who need it, jobs, the economy, bank transfers, those things we take for granted are now able to come into play.
But we've heard before, and we've heard when the factions were fighting, when Druze were facing slaughter just months ago, we heard that a lot of the problems that were faced by the Syrian people on the day-to-day basis were solvable financially. It was to do with finances more than it was to do with land. So when the US is now given the backing to Al-Sharaa, that then proves that he can go back, and having taken the helm less than a year ago at this stage, it will allow him to go into this in a much stronger position. And with financial backing, I think Syria can make a turnaround here. And I think that's the more important takeaway from this.
Absolutely. And I think that's what all the hopes are pinned on.
There is this important question here, guys, of what kind of rule Al-Shara's government is going to enforce back in Syria. It's a very new government, as we pointed out, and Al-Sharaa has clearly made his mark on the international stage. That's evidenced by this historic meeting with the US president. But I do think Washington is sort of taking the temperature a little bit, testing out the boundaries of this new relationship with the Syrian president, waiting to see how he works out some of those difficulties that are emerging back home with how he'll govern. And this lifting of the Caesar Act, it's for 180 days. So it is undoubtedly a major win for the Syrian president, and Washington clearly pinning their hopes on him and Syria's future, that he will be able to take the country forward here.
And what Sara said there is also really important, because lots of these sanctions have been lifted with conditions on them, conditions that Al-Sharaa follows, and that comes from the US and other international partners that have done the same thing. But once again, taking the temperature in the States. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that, Sara and Jono. Stay right there as we move on to another story now. And the BBC has issued an apology and said it made an error of judgment over how it edited a speech by President Trump in a Panorama documentary that made it look like he was urging people to attack the US Capitol. It follows the resignation of the CEO of the BBC News, Deborah Turners, and its Director General, Tim Davie, last night. They both admitted mistakes had been made. Meanwhile, President Trump has sent a letter to the BBC threatening to sue the organisation for $1 billion. Jono, this story broke last night. It has not stopped. We have had update after update after update. Are you surprised by this story, or do you think it's right that Davie and Turners took the decision to just walk away from what has been a pretty turbulent time?
It has, but it's been going on behind the scenes for quite a while. And we'll know that this has been going on for months and months. From whenever Ofcom will initially have raised that complaint, behind the scenes there have been a lot of back and forth about what should we do here. I think a few things have happened at the BBC that meant that their position was untenable. First of all, it wasn't tackled in the correct way. Admitting that something has been done incorrectly, stating a formal apology, and then on Sunday morning going on the BBC and saying, we apologise, we've made a mistake, which they'll do quite readily about a story about potholes, but they won't do it when it comes to something of such huge magnitude. The Trump administration sees this as an opportunity to take the BBC down a peg or two, not take them out, but take them down a peg or two, and to join the 34 other media entities that are currently being sued by Donald Trump. Taking into consideration that he had 7 in the decade previously before he took into office, now 34 since the 2 presidencies, it's quite a lot. And $1 billion, actually not a lot that he's taken them for when you take into consideration some of the other ones that I'll talk about in a second. Did they make the right decision to leave? You will know, if you know anything about the industry, that the DG and the CEO are not the people who made the end decisions here, but they're being complacent in the fact that they kept so quiet about it for so long, and that they didn't open up and they didn't say, right, let's open it completely. And I think you have to do this because there will be a parliamentary inquiry about this, because it is public money that is funding the BBC. And I think what we're seeing here is damage control, an effort to prevent or try and protect the BBC's credibility, or what little remains. But I think that they're facing a bit of a losing battle. And even just YouGov have conducted a poll, which was done, I think, 3 months ago. So before this broke, but when there had been other BBC scandals that had broke, they've got a record low level of public trust right now. 44% of the public believe that they're impartial.
But, Jono, I also wonder if it's not just because of this scandal that we've seen of the editing of a BBC documentary that went out that edited Donald Trump's speech. I've got that right in the end. But there's been so many scandals when it comes to the BBC. Hugh Edwards, one of its news presenters, Bob Villian at Glastonbury. There's just felt like Tim Westwood, the DJ. I just think there's been scandal after scandal after scandal, but no one's come up quick enough.
Well, when we take into consideration what this specific story is about, and that Trump a second chance, when it was aired was, I believe it was 28th of October, so just before the elections. So it's something of this changing something or changing the narrative, and I mean, we'll talk about what was actually said versus what was in there. there's been numerous scandals that have been there. They've all kind of piled up at this stage. And you're taking into consideration that it is public money that's been spent here. And so you have this changing of the guard where they'll think, right, if we do this, we'll protect ourselves and we'll limit the damage. The damage has been done, not just by this, but also by the three others. And that's the tip of the iceberg. If we really look back historically, you're talking about stuff that's happened in the last 2 years. If you look back further than that again, you'll see a lot more impartiality when it comes to the BBC. And I think they're finally being held accountable for this. And I think it's probably about time. We tend to find that we'll side with our own media at this stage. You'll decide, are you left, are you right, are you central, where are you going to go? You'll pick your media. The BBC have attempted to be that neutral, impartial ground, and they've just done a really bad job of it up until now.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think, I'm sure Sarah has an opinion on this too, I also think the way that journalists work now is quite different. You know, we're seeing social media and we're seeing people with YouTube channels who are quite clearly either right or left, and they're quite happy to say, this is what we are, this is what we believe in. Basically, you watch me, this is what you get on the tin. And I think people watching the BBC are like, we don't really know where they're going with this. So, Sarah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And, you know, if it's even possible that Donald Trump could sue the BBC.
Well, look, his legal team have come out swinging, threatening this $1 billion in legal action. They've said they want three things to happen. They've given the BBC a couple of days to respond to it. They want, one, a full and fair retraction, two, an immediate apology, and three, they want President Trump appropriately compensated for what they say, look, President Trump was the victim of what they call false and defamatory statements. Now, guys, I do think it's worth sort of going over the origin of this, because we're used to seeing President Trump, right, criticizing and hitting out at fake news media, but it's usually targeted at the American media. This time, it's the BBC in his sites. This is around a Panorama documentary that went out and an edit that was made in that documentary. Now, it was back to the speech that President Trump gave before you had the Capitol riots. On the same day that the Capitol riots happened, we had then outgoing President Trump giving this speech. And what you had in the Panorama edit was two pieces of that speech cut together and some pictures put over it so you couldn't really see the edit. That is at the centre of this argument. And guys, we're all journalists, so we know. And for people at home who don't know, you just don't do that in media. It is not the done thing at all. It's a cardinal sin, frankly, for a journalist to do it. So there are huge questions. And it is pretty shocking as a journalist, right, that the BBC, who are known for having really rigorous, high-level editorial standards, this somehow got through the net. There are questions over how that happened, how it was able to be broadcast in this way. But it is worth looking at the things that were actually said. So there's one part where President Trump comes out and he says in the speech, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. We're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. Now, in a separate piece of the speech, but this is what the Panorama piece edited together, he says, we're going to have to fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Now, both of those pieces of speech, President Trump did say, and I was there on the day that he gave that speech, and I then walked down to Capitol Hill with the protesters and watched the Capitol riots unfold. I can tell you here in the US, President Trump has come in for a huge amount of scrutiny and criticism for that comment, we fight like hell. Now, the Trump team, the president has always claimed and maintained that he was using that as a sort of rhetoric. It wasn't a literal direction. But there is no question here, right? The BBC have clearly made a mistake. Now you've had the heads of the network falling on their swords in this way. But there are so many unanswered questions over how this was able to happen. But look, at the same time, you know, the BBC is respected the world over. It is known for having very high editorial standards. And so I think a little bit of Trump's narrative here, you know, he's obviously taking it pretty seriously. He's paying attention to what is going on, but it is worth remembering the events that led up to the Capitol riots and the criticisms that the president still continues to face for the words that he did actually say.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick thought on it, because Sara is right to point out, you know, the BBC journalists work very hard to have a balanced perspective of what we cover on the news. It's difficult sometimes, of course, Jono, but also we're looking at Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform Party in the UK, spoke to Donald Trump and said this was election interference.
It effectively was, because I said it aired on the 28th of October, which means that it was just before the election. And you are using public money. You are supposed to be impartial. You have a duty of care to the people who are paying your salary as the CEO and the DG of the BBC in order to be able to ensure that the information you're providing is impartial. And we know how difficult this can be. In relation to what Sara said as regards to how serious is Donald Trump taking this, that's a good question, because if you look at the lawsuit level versus what he's normally taken, we're looking at 15 billion is normally the go-to, 10 to 15 billion is what he normally will claim for. And this is 1 billion. So it actually seems like maybe he's not even that concerned by something like this. And it's more of something he said, listen, let's do it. ABC, the last case that he took was 15 million. And that was a settlement that he took for that, 15 billion, sorry, that he took for that. You have to think, is it potentially something that you just go, it's more of a token gesture where I say, listen, I'm going to take the BBC to the cleaners because I feel they didn't do right by me. And the BBC has been respected for the longest time because they've rightly so done an amazing job on being impartial journalists. And on this occasion, they dropped the ball completely.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on that, Sara and Jono. Let's move on now. And a deal aimed at ending the US government shutdown has passed in the Senate. It comes after a weekend of negotiations between Democrats and Republicans. A further vote from the House of Representatives required before federal services can resume. But it's looking positive after a record-breaking 40 days of deadlock. Here's what the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, had to say a little bit earlier.
The Senate is moving forward on an amended House CR, a continuing resolution, that will reopen the government until January 30th. Added to that are provisions to fully fund SNAP provisions through the end of the next fiscal year, which is September 2026, guaranteed back pay for all federal workers who have been made to endure these hardships over the last several weeks. And it also includes passage of 3 appropriations bills, which we're grateful to be moving through the process. At the very moment that they do that final vote, I will call all House members to return to Washington as quickly as possible. We'll give a 36-hour formal and official notice so that we can vote as soon as possible to pass the amended CR bill and get it to the president's desk.
Sara, it's been such a busy day over in the US. Well, that's an understatement. Busy weekend. You are, of course, on the ground there. What's the latest from Capitol Hill? And when could we see workers returning to full pay? 40 days, the longest shutdown ever.
I know, and that shutdown, guys, the end might be in sight. We've heard the president saying that the end is close. It's close, it's not there yet, but what we saw Sunday night is a very unusual, quite rare gathering in the Senate to vote to advance this deal that would see government reopened. You had some of the Democrats enough deciding that they would make a compromise. So at the heart of this, before you had the government shutdown, was the Democrats' demand that they wanted to see an immediate extension to the affordable healthcare benefits. Now, if that doesn't happen, it potentially puts millions of Americans who use the Affordable Care Act protections in a difficult situation, facing almost double in some cases, I think, their health insurance payments. So it is a huge, huge issue for the Democrats. What they have backed down on essentially is saying that there will be an immediate extension of those benefits. What the Republicans have given them is that there will be a vote on extending at some point in December. But that's obviously quite a watered down version of their demands. Now, what happens next? Because, you know, especially if you're not in America and you haven't been brought up with American politics, I still find it confusing sometimes. You have both the Senate and the House as part of Congress who have to agree on passing this bill. So first of all, we're going to get the Senate having to actually vote again and pass this package of measures. It will then go to the House. That's expected to take potentially a couple of days at least. You've got to get all the House representatives here into DC. And of course, you've got the flight chaos at the moment as a result of the shutdown. And then if both the Senate and the House vote to pass the bill, this package of measures to keep the government funded up until the end of January, then the president will sign off on it and government will reopen. So the lights are flickering back on, but we're not there yet. And of course, as the next couple of days play out, you've got the continuing bite being felt of this government shutdown. You know, flight chaos, the issues with the federal workers who have faced very, very tough conditions. You know, 40 days without pay in some instances. It has had a huge impact on Americans. So there is going to be a collective sigh of relief, I'm sure, across the country right now, that the end does seem to finally be in sight.
And you know, Jono, I always think when it comes to shutdowns and we talk about them, it's basically which party can endure the most pain for how long. And finally, we've seen some, as Sarah said, the lights are flickering, but not quite back on. 40 days without pay.
It's a lot.
For a lot of workers, that's a lot.
It's a lot. And even when we spoke about this earlier on, who's going to get back paid at this stage, who's been furloughed and who's entitled to cash back. But what we've spoken about, and everyone has, the top line stories of this have been the people who are in power, who are in jobs, who have been furloughed or who are out their position because of this. There is millions, 41 million Americans who are at the other end, the receiving end, or should be, of SNAP, that's food stamps, or some sort of food assistance, or even renter's assistance as well, who potentially are facing eviction as a result of this shutdown, because it's not just people who are sitting in offices who have, as a result of this, suffered. People are, and this is, the description of this was said that it's pushed the reliance and the food insecurity rates in the US up by 7%, which is quite astronomical if you look at that for that 41 million Americans who are now suffering. But single parents suffered. Scientific and medical, even clinical trials would all have been halted while this was going on. So people who may have been on temporary treatment or clinical treatment for trials to try and cure them would also have been halted. So all of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes is a real concern. So now it's about getting things back on track once again. And yeah, you're right, it's about who blinks first and who's going to cave first in this kind of a situation. But I think both parties have had to lose a little bit of their leverage to say, right, we need to see this sorted out. 40 days is a ludicrous amount of time for people to be who are relying on food stamps week on week to try and make ends meet. It's almost impossible. It couldn't have gone on any longer. And Sara will know from where she is, it's the day-to-day people who are suffering as a result of this.
And what's also something interesting is we talk about the fact that people didn't receive money for a month, but they will be back paid, those who haven't been in their jobs during the shutdown. But a lot of analysts are saying they live hand to mouth, month by month, and they've had to use credit cards to get themselves through this month. And once that back pay comes up, that's just basically paying back the debt, probably with interest too.
Yeah.
So it becomes a never-ending cycle when we see something like a shutdown.
Even in productivity alone, 24 billion wiped off because of the lack of productivity for the last 40 days for people who've been on furlough. We know from COVID, furlough is basically an excuse to sit at home and do nothing, which is exactly what's happened for the people who were occupying those positions. And the unfortunate thing is now that, like you said, it will have exactly the same effect as COVID, just not for as long a period of time, and without the payout from a cash check that's going to be sent out to everyone in the country to try and get you back on your feet again, because once you get into that cycle of debt, it's almost impossible to get out of it.
Exactly. Very good point. Sara and Jono, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Stay right there. And we're going to move on to another story now. And an anonymous family in London are on the lookout for a tutor, but with a little bit of a difference. The advert calls for someone extraordinary and experienced to support their youngest child on his first steps to becoming an English gentleman. Hundreds of people have applied for the post with a salary of £180,000 a year. Jono, have you applied for the job? What more do we know about this job? The English gentleman. Okay, 180 a year. That's not bad.
Well, the position has already been filled from the website. It's been removed as a listing. And on that note, I have a little announcement. No, I am neither of those. I am neither of those things. Unfortunately, I'm not qualified enough for this. But it is a stack of cash, 180,000. That's British pounds a year to tutor their son. Now you think, well, what age is the kid? It's a 1-year-old kid. The role involves, and the ad is very descriptive, teaching mannerisms, manners, language, posture, and cultural habits, but from infancy. So you're now taking a 1-year-old, and critics are saying, well, this is absurd. You're going to try and mould a baby so early. Others are saying, you know what this is? Visionary. This is visionary parenting. This is how it's supposed to be. And it's a big market now. Tutoring globally is a big market, but tutoring for making the perfect English gentleman, I guess it requires a certain je ne sais quoi. Unfortunately, I don't possess that. But it's a lot of money for something that really should be taught in schools. And I don't know if doing it from the age of 1 is a little bit unnecessary, but you can never start them too early if you want to help them achieve Eton by the time they're 17 years old.
I don't know. 1 year old? I mean, should the child be a child? But Sarah, you are, of course, a mum. You're from England. And would you be keen to raise your son as an English gentleman? Is that important when you have children as you bring them into the world, or should they just basically be children?
Well, look, first of all, Jono, you are a perfect gentleman. I would be very happy to have you tutor my little son, who has just turned 1. We have an ongoing debate in our household because I'm British, my husband is Turkish, so my son is British, Turkish, American. Guys, I can tell you, they kind of come out with their own personalities. Like, my son is unquestionably Turkish. He likes Turkish cuisine. He is not interested in my British cooking. We actually have some of the images of him. Recently, you had Keir Starmer and Turkey's President Erdogan meeting and talking, and we got a shot of him looking at both of the leaders, and we were wondering which one that he would more naturally be drawn towards. But yeah, look, he's got even Turkish mannerisms, honestly, and he's not speaking fully yet, but he makes sounds that I can't pronounce because obviously my husband speaks to him in Turkish. I love the idea of having a tutor to make him a little English gentleman, but also some of the requirements on the advert are things that, like, most British people don't really, you know, the sort of speaking in, what's it called, RP, received pronunciation, is that it? I mean, just, you know, that's not really what it means to be British. I will also just point out, though, because I told you guys this earlier, when my son started picking up books, I thought, oh, he's a genius. And my father, always one to keep me humble, reminded me that John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, the English philosopher, was able to read and write in Greek by the age of 5. So that is the standard, I guess, these days that we're expected to meet as parents. But I don't know. I think it's nicer to just get out there, play a little bit, have your childhood, and worry about the academics maybe a bit later.
In saying that, I think if you want to give them the best shot in life, and you think if you have the money and you're thinking, I'd like to give them that element of it. I don't know how much of the time is going to be spent tutoring. It's gone into some detail with regards to how many days off you have. And it said there's a lot of time spare. You've got a lot of free time because the kid is only 1, so how much tutoring could you need to do? But I think never an opportunity. Otherwise, maybe it's a missed opportunity. You don't know what the child could have achieved if you had started that role of tutoring them from a very early age, and you've tried to... And the old Victorian era of having a governess and having somebody who's on hand, and that seemed to have worked quite well for a lot of people. And I think there's that nature versus nurture argument, and there's certainly people who, if they'd had this opportunity in life, they could have reached their full potential. And then if by the age of 5 or 6 you'd realise that maybe perhaps we're not dealing with the brightest spark in the box, then at that stage you might think, okay, I'm wasting 180 grand a year. But I think it's getting them on the right path initially to see what you could potentially achieve. You could have the next Isaac Newton, you could have another Albert Einstein. But you won't know unless you spend the cash.
Could have the next Elon Musk.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Or maybe even an amazing genius.
I mean, you never know. I do think you've put up a good argument, both of you. I'm not a parent, but I also think it's very difficult because everyone comes out with their own personality, don't they? And there's no way that you can change her, no matter what parenting you try to put in place.
You can mould it a little bit.
A little bit.
For 180 grand a year, you'd want to...
Are you going to be a ballerina, Leigh-Ann?
Pardon?
Are you not going to be a ballerina
No.
at one point?
My mum. 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 My English teacher. My English had to be impeccable at home. And she really wanted me to be a ballerina, to dance and to play a musical instrument and to speak a second language. Well, I escaped from ballet. I played on the tennis courts, fought the boys on the jungle gym, caused absolute havoc. She gave up. I wouldn't go to the lessons for the guitar, and I wouldn't speak another language, and I still don't. I was a protester. I protested. I was not going to follow them on. So that's why it's really difficult, isn't it? You have all these dreams, but at the end of the day, your child is your child and does what they enjoy.
Look, everyone's got aspirations for their kids as well, and they'd like them to do the best version of them they can possibly be. And I think this is a family with a lot more money than sense, potentially, on something like this. And your kids will turn out how your kids turn out.
Well, Sara and Jono, I think your parents should be very, very proud of both of you. And now it's that time of the show where we move on to two of the quirkiest stories that Jono and Sara have chosen. And Sara, yours is actually about a lion that Irish police have been chasing. Jono's, of course, Irish. He can tell us about how an Irish gentleman might catch a lion, but tell us a little bit more.
Yes, this is close to home for you, Jono. So this is a brilliant story. The police in County Clare in Western Ireland, they received a phone call of a lion-like creature on the loose. Guys, when I read the story, the first thing I had to do was go to Google and find out, are there wild lions in Ireland? I thought I knew that that was obviously a no, but it is a no. Whoever made the phone call, though, they were also unsure. The police went to investigate, and it turns out it was a dog, and I think we've got the picture for you. It was a dog who'd had a very interesting new haircut, and to absolutely cherry on top of this story, its name is Mouse, which is adorable and hilarious, and so everyone can stand down and relax. There is no lions on the loose in Ireland as of right now. There is, however, a dog called Mouse with a very fancy haircut.
Jono, you are actually not far from County Clare.
No.
Where Mouse was found.
It's not the first time we've had an issue whereby somebody's reported seeing a jaguar,
Are they bored?
a panther. I don't think so. I think it might be on the way home after a late night. You catch a glimpse of something in the distance, and all of a sudden, there's a lion on the loose. And again, it's not the first time, but they normally tend to be a cat, like a wild cat is what tends to normally be spotted. And 9 times out of 10, it ends up being... Once, it actually genuinely was a jaguar. But aside from that, it's been nothing but just misses with dogs with nice haircuts.
I must say something. If my dog went for a haircut and came back like that, I would be pretty angry.
Yeah.
It's a pretty diabolical haircut. Anyway.
It's an interesting haircut.
Poor little dog, imagine. Anyway, Jono, no surprise here, but apparently more than half of us aren't doing enough exercise, apparently.
Yeah. Turns out we're lazy. 55% of adults don't reach the recommended amount of exercise levels per week, and it's actually a surprisingly low number of minutes you need to do. 150 minutes a week. That's how much you need to be active for. And we're not talking about heavy exercise as well. We're talking about just moving your body. 6 hours a day is what we spend sitting down. Taken outside of your sleep, 6 hours a day sitting down seems like a long time to be sitting. But the average adult human, regardless of gender, 6,500 steps a day, which seems a little on the low side, to be honest, and it seems very achievable.
I'm really shocked by this, only because if you know me, or you watch my show, all I do is exercise. So 7 days a week, I either lift weights or I go to Pilates. I walk the dogs every day. I feel like my whole life revolves around exercise. I actually get stressed if I can't get in the class, the right Pilates class, like they all need to be booked in advance. And Sara, I don't know about you, but how do you live without like going for a little walk in the morning? Or I don't know, I find it interesting.
I am with the wrong crowd right now because I am very happy to be to be a spectator to other people. Listen, I've got an excuse. I'm pregnant, so that's been my excuse for years. I can't remember what my excuse was before that or what it will be after that. But, you know, come on, embrace the lazy, guys. You've got to have a couple of lazy days in bed. You know what? It is important, and I always feel better when I exercise, and I am so in awe of people like you, Leigh-Ann and Jono, who are fitness experts, and I wish I could be more like that. But
I am reluctantly. I did 46,000 steps last Sunday because I moved house, not because I wanted to do 46,000 steps. I'm reluctant at best. And most people are. It turns out we're too tired, we don't have time. Work is taking up some of our time. And now they're saying that electrical vehicles are the reason that some people are even getting more lazy. Not because you just laze around all day and wait for your EV to charge, but that's part of it. You might be out somewhere, you have to charge your vehicle, it's going to take more than 30 minutes. So therefore, instead of just waiting by your car and doing some push keepy-uppies or steps or something, you'll go and have a coffee and a sit down and a slice of cake. And they're saying that people with an EV are more likely to be lazy as a result. The reasoning behind it is it's costing, this is specifically for the UK, they did a check to find out, and it's about £7.5 billion in lost productivity every single year from people who are just too lazy to get up and do stuff. And they're saying we just need a bit of a change.
I mean, I don't know why, I just find this mind-boggling.
Some people are, I'm normally fine to sit down on the sofa. I just need to point that out as well. But 6,500 is just a little bit on the slim side.
Yeah, it's on the slim
10,000
side.
steps a day, otherwise you're not.
Showing off, Jono. You're showing off with your step count.
No, I
Look, if napping was an Olympic sport, I'd be up there.
Yeah, and can I tell you what? I actually think that I can't nap and I can't just sit on the sofa. I think I've got a problem. I've got to clean. So if I'm watching a film, I've got to clean while I'm watching the film, because sitting down stresses me.
I feel like that should be medicated.
Yeah, I think that should be. Anyway, moving on. Thank you so much to today's guest, Dubai 92 presenter Jono Hayes, who's of course in the studio with me, and correspondent Sara Firth, who's joined us all the way from Washington. Thanks to all of you from us on W News Extra. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, follow us on X. GNT will be coming up next. Goodbye. Thank you and have a nice evening.